Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 5 horror stories. If you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The Curse of the Forsaken Grove. The wind howled through the trees like the wail of a lost soul, the dry leaves rustling like whispers of forgotten promises. In the small village of Sable Hollow, nestled at the foot of a forgotten mountain range, there was one place no one dared go: the Forsaken Grove. Local legends said the forest was cursed, a place where time stood still and darkness hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. But it was not the curse itself that terrified the villagers. It was the witch who had once called the grove her home. Her name was Mabe, an ancient sorceress who had been banished from the village long ago after a series of mysterious deaths. Some said she had been a healer. Others claimed she was a witch who had learned to control the very elements. Either way, Mabe had a gift that made her a powerful ally and a deadly enemy. The people of Sable Hollow had feared her, but fear turned to hate when one winter, children began to disappear. No trace, no clues, only empty, frozen footprints leading into the trees. The villagers, in their desperation, went to Mabe for help, begging her to use her magic to bring their children back. But she refused. She warned them that if they sought her aid, they would pay a terrible price. The villagers, blinded by grief and rage, ignored her warning. They marched into the forest and demanded she help them. Mabe, knowing their hearts were filled with anger, cast a curse upon them, a curse that would be passed down through generations. No one would remember the truth. No one would remember her name, and anyone who dared enter the grove would never leave. Years passed, and the village began to forget Mabe. The forest was abandoned. The children who had vanished were never spoken of again, and the people lived in relative peace until one fateful autumn. It began with a strange, cold breeze sweeping through the village, followed by the smell of decay that filled the air. One by one, children began to vanish again. The parents searched frantically, but no one could find them. They remembered the old stories, the curse of Mabe, and the fear that had long been buried began to resurface. Dara, a young woman whose brother had gone missing in the latest wave of disappearances, could not sit idly by. She knew she had to find the truth, even if it meant risking everything. Armed with little more than her courage and a faded map her grandmother had once given her, Dara ventured into the Forsaken Grove. The air was thick and oppressive as she stepped into the forest, the trees seeming to close in around her. The path was almost impossible to follow, winding and treacherous, as if the forest itself were trying to lead her astray. But Dara pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find her brother. She had to end the curse. As she ventured deeper into the grove, the sounds of the forest grew strangely quiet. The birds fell silent. The wind stopped. And then, from the shadows between the trees, a figure emerged. It was Mabe, or what was left of her. Her once beautiful face was now twisted and decayed, her skin pale and stretched tight over her skull. But her eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, and they fixed upon Dara with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "You should not have come," Mabe whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The curse was meant to protect you. But now it is too late." Dara took a step back, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, pulling her forward as though the forest itself were hungry for her. Mabe raised a skeletal hand, and the trees around them began to tremble, their branches twisting and creaking like the bones of ancient creatures. "You have awakened me," Mabe continued, her voice soft yet piercing. "And for that, you will join the others." Dara's heart raced as she tried to back away, but something invisible wrapped around her, holding her in place. The trees groaned as if in pain, and a dark, swirling mist began to rise from the ground, enveloping her. Her eyes stung, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She fought against the invisible force, but it was no use. "Your brother is already with me," Mabe's voice echoed, now mocking, "as will all of them be. Forever." In that moment, Dara saw it, her brother, standing in the mist, his eyes hollow and empty. His body was motionless, a shell of the boy she once knew. She screamed, struggling to break free, but the mist swallowed her whole. The next morning, the villagers found a new set of footprints leading into the grove, this time belonging to a young woman. They whispered the old legends again, but no one dared to venture into the cursed forest. And so, the curse of Maba's revenge continued, the forest now claiming more lives, more souls, with each passing year. The forsaken grove remained a place of death, a monument to the witch's wrath. The witch's heart. Lena had always been drawn to the old manor on the edge of town. She had heard the stories, how the house was once a grand estate, filled with laughter and warmth. But those days were long gone. Now, the manor was nothing more than a decaying relic of the past, its windows cracked, and its front door hanging off its hinges. The townsfolk whispered that the house was cursed, and that anyone who dared to enter would never return. But Lena, with her insatiable curiosity and the rebellion of youth, never truly believed in the superstitions. It was the stories of the witch that intrigued her the most. They said she had lived in the manor centuries ago, a woman of unmatched beauty and power. She was rumored to have been a healer, a woman who could cure any ailment with a single touch. But as with all things in life, her powers came with a price. Eventually, her magic turned dark, twisted by greed and jealousy, and the witch began to perform rituals, sacrifices to feed her insatiable hunger for power. One night, in a fit of rage, the villagers had stormed the manor, demanding the witch's death. The air had been thick with anger and fear, and when they found her, she was not the beautiful woman they had once adored, but a withered crone with eyes full of madness. The witch swore vengeance as the mob dragged her to the flames. "Even in death, I shall not rest," she had screamed as she was consumed by the fire. "I will return to claim your hearts and your souls." The villagers thought her death would put an end to the curse, but they were wrong. Lena had always felt a strange pull toward the manor, and that pull had only grown stronger as the years passed. So, one evening, under the cover of dusk, she made her way through the overgrown path leading to the estate. The wind whistled through the trees, and the sky above was an unnatural shade of violet, casting long shadows across the grounds. The house loomed before her, the once grand structure now sagging under the weight of age. As Lena stepped onto the porch, a chill ran down her spine, but she pressed on. The door creaked open with a long, tortured groan, as if the house itself were warning her to turn back. Inside, the air was musty and thick with dust. The grand chandelier overhead hung like a forgotten star, its crystals tarnished and dull. Everything about the house screamed of decay, but Lena was undeterred. She wandered deeper, her footsteps echoing through the hollow halls. Suddenly, she felt it. A presence. A cold, suffocating presence that seemed to crawl across her skin, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She spun around, but saw nothing. Only the oppressive darkness that filled every corner. Then, a voice, a whisper, so faint it was almost inaudible, drifted to her ears. "Lena." She froze. The voice was old, like the wind that blows through the cracks of a forgotten tomb. It was soft, seductive, and unmistakable. "Lena," it repeated, this time louder, closer. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Who's there?" she called, but her voice faltered, swallowed by the heavy silence. The whispering grew louder. A soft, scraping sound followed, like fingernails dragging across wood. Lena backed away, her mind racing. She turned toward the grand staircase, but something caught her eye. In the dim light, she saw it, a large, ornate mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. At first, she thought it was just the distortion of the dark, but then she saw it clearly. A figure, half obscured, but unmistakable. A woman. She was tall, regal, with long dark hair that seemed to flow even though there was no breeze. Her skin was as pale as death, and her eyes, those eyes, were black as night, glowing with an unnatural hunger. The woman smiled at Lena, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The air grew colder, and the very walls of the manor seemed to pulse with the woman's malevolent energy. "No," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. You're not real." But the figure in the mirror tilted her head, and the smile grew wider. "I am as real as the heart you brought with you, Lena." A sharp, piercing pain suddenly exploded in Lena's chest. She gasped, stumbling back, her hands clutching her ribs. Blood soaked through her shirt. It felt as if her heart were being squeezed by an invisible hand, pulling it from her chest. The figure in the mirror laughed, a sound that echoed through Lena's skull. "I warned them," she purred. "I warned them all. The witch's heart is always the last to break. And now, it belongs to me." Lena's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her vision blurring as blood trickled down her mouth. But the last thing she saw before everything went dark was the reflection of the witch in the mirror, stepping out from the glass, her hands stretched wide, ready to claim Lena's soul. The next morning, the townspeople found the manor eerily silent. There was no sign of Lena, no trace of her ever existing. But the mirror, that cursed mirror, hung on the wall still, its glass dark as night, reflecting only the empty room and the faint outline of a figure. Always watching, always waiting. And far below, in the depths of the manor's foundation, the witch's heart beat once again, steady and cold. The witch's mirror. The village of Hollowbrook was built on old secrets. Nestled between dense, dark forests, it was a place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, but there were things that were never spoken of, things that the older generation warned the young to stay away from. One such thing was the old house at the edge of town, known simply as the witch's house. It had stood there for centuries, crumbling and abandoned, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the nothingness. No one had lived there in years, at least, no one in the flesh. The locals spoke of an old witch, a woman named Isolde, who once lived there. Her powers were said to be unmatched, her beauty mesmerizing. They said that she could see into the very souls of men and women, and that she could grant any wish for a price. But Isolde had been gone for years. Or so they thought. One summer evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, a stranger arrived in Hollowbrook. His name was Samuel, a traveling historian who had heard whispers of the witch's house and its mysteries. He was drawn to the place, captivated by the tales of the past and the promise of uncovering the truth behind Isolde's life. The townsfolk warned him to stay away, their eyes wide with fear as they spoke of the curse that haunted the witch's house. But Samuel, eager to make a name for himself, ignored them. The house called to him, and he could not resist. He made his way to the house at dusk, the forest surrounding him like a living, breathing entity. The trees seemed to close in as he approached, their branches reaching out like bony fingers. As he crossed the threshold of the house, the air grew thick, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The house was decayed, but there was something about it that still felt alive, as if it were waiting for him. Inside, dust hung in the air, and the floors creaked under his weight. The faint smell of decay lingered in the corners, mixed with a floral fragrance he could not place. He moved through the rooms, each one more ominous than the last, until he reached the back of the house, where he found a large, ornate mirror. It was framed in dark wood, intricately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. The mirror's surface was clouded, as if it had not been cleaned in ages. Yet, despite the age of the house, the mirror seemed untouched by time, its glass as clear as if it had been polished only moments before. Something about the mirror felt wrong. The room around it seemed to warp, the shadows twisting and flickering. Samuel's reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't quite right. His image in the mirror appeared darker, more distorted, as if someone else were staring at him from the other side. His heart began to race as the reflection shifted, and he found himself unable to look away. Then he heard it, a voice, soft and lilting, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was a woman's voice, full of sorrow and longing. "Do you seek what I can offer, Samuel?" Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The voice was coming from the mirror. He stumbled back, but his feet refused to move. The shadows in the room grew longer, darker, and the air seemed to close in around him. He couldn't escape. "Isolde," the voice continued, more insistent now. "I can give you everything you desire. Power, knowledge, immortality. All you need to do is ask." Samuel's mind raced. He had read about the witch, of course. He had heard the legends, how she had once been the most powerful sorceress in the land, how she had given her soul to the mirror in exchange for eternal life. But he had never believed the stories. Until now, he stepped closer to the mirror, his curiosity outweighing the terror that gripped him. "What do you want in return?" he asked, his voice trembling. The reflection of Isolde appeared in the mirror, her face pale and otherworldly, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "I want nothing," she whispered. "I have everything. But for you to have what you desire, you must give me your soul." Samuel's blood ran cold. He had heard the price, but to hear it spoken aloud, that was something else. "I don't believe you," he spat, trying to shake the unease that had taken root in his chest. But Isolde's reflection only smiled, her lips curving into a sadistic grin. "Do you truly think you have a choice?" she murmured. "I have been waiting for someone like you, for someone who seeks what they cannot have." The air in the room grew heavier, pressing in on him from all sides. Samuel's heart began to race as he felt the grip of something unseen closing around him. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, becoming slick with something wet and foul. He tried to pull away from the mirror, but his feet were rooted to the spot, as if the house itself had claimed him. The reflection of Isolde in the mirror began to reach out toward him, her hands moving through the glass like it was water. Slowly, they began to take form, her fingers elongating and twisting unnaturally, until they wrapped around Samuel's throat. His breath caught in his chest as he struggled to break free, but it was no use. The mirror's grip on him was too strong, its power too overwhelming. "Your soul is mine, Samuel," Isolde's voice purred, as the last of the light in the room flickered and died. "You will never leave this place. You will become part of the mirror, just like all those before you. I am eternal." The last thing Samuel saw was the reflection of his own terrified face, his body being pulled into the glass. His screams echoed in the empty house as he vanished, becoming nothing more than another soul trapped within the witch's mirror. The townsfolk found the house abandoned once again, the mirror still standing in the corner. But they never spoke of Samuel, and they never spoke of Isolde. Some things were better left forgotten. And as for the mirror, it continued to wait, its glass now clear and polished, its surface reflecting only the faces of those who dared to look. The witch's curse. The town of Ravenswood was once a peaceful place, surrounded by forests that stretched for miles and lakes so still they mirrored the sky. But that was long ago, before the witch came. Her name was Evelyn, a woman of dark beauty, with raven-black hair and eyes that gleamed like the full moon. No one knew where she came from, only that she had arrived one winter's night, as cold as death itself, with nothing but a tattered cloak and a worn leather pouch. She seemed harmless at first, a stranger seeking refuge from the cold. But soon, the villagers began to notice strange things happening around her. At first, it was small things, crops growing with unnatural speed, animals acting strangely, and whispers that seemed to come from the wind itself. But then, one by one, the children of Ravenswood began to disappear. The townsfolk were terrified. No one knew where they went or why. And yet, every full moon, the cries of children could be heard echoing through the woods, agonized, haunting cries that sent chills through even the bravest souls. The people turned on Evelyn. They accused her of witchcraft, of sacrificing the children to some dark god in exchange for power. They burned her house to the ground, chasing her into the forest with torches and pitchforks. But Evelyn was not afraid. She simply smiled as they came for her, a cruel, knowing smile that promised retribution. "Foolish mortals," she whispered, "you do not understand the price of what you've stolen." That was the last anyone saw of Evelyn. The villagers, satisfied with their vengeance, thought the witch was gone for good. But they could not have been more wrong. Years passed, and the children of Ravenswood returned. But they were different. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale and cold to the touch. They no longer smiled or laughed. They walked like shadows, their voices a faint echo of what they once were. It was then that the village realized the truth. Evelyn had not been killed. She had cursed them all. Her revenge was not swift. It was eternal. The curse she had cast on the town was one of transformation. Every child that had vanished would return, not as a living soul, but as a twisted reflection of their former selves. And with each passing year, more children would be taken, until the town was filled with nothing but empty vessels, slaves to the witch's dark will. One by one, families disappeared from Ravenswood. The children who returned could no longer be called human. They spoke in a language no one understood, and their eyes were empty, devoid of the spark of life. It was as though their souls had been torn from them, leaving only husks in their place. But the worst part came when a small group of survivors, the last remaining villagers, decided to fight back. They believed that if they could destroy Evelyn's spirit, they could break the curse and free the children. So, they ventured into the forest, seeking her out. They found her, eventually, deep within the heart of the woods. She stood alone, her back to them, her long black hair flowing like ink in the wind. Her face was older now, her once beautiful features warped by time and dark magic. But she was still powerful, and she was still angry. "You should not have come," Evelyn said, her voice low and cold. "You cannot undo what has been done." The villagers begged her to stop, to end the curse, to return the children to the life they had once known. But Evelyn only laughed, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves in a storm. "I warned you," she said. "Now you will pay the price." Before they could react, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The trees around them twisted and groaned, as if alive, their roots rising up from the earth like serpents. The air grew thick with dark magic, and the sky turned black as night. From the shadows of the forest, the children emerged. Their eyes were hollow, their skin as white as bone, and they moved like puppets on invisible strings. They surrounded the villagers, their hands outstretched, their mouths open in silent screams. Evelyn's eyes gleamed with malice as she watched the villagers fall to their knees, their faces twisted in terror. "This is the price of your ignorance," she said softly. "Now you, too, will become like them." One by one, the villagers were consumed by the children, their souls trapped within their empty bodies. And with each soul that was taken, Evelyn's power grew stronger, until the entire town of Ravenswood was swallowed by the curse. The once peaceful village was now a place of eternal darkness, its streets haunted by the hollow eyes of the lost. To this day, Ravenswood remains a place that no one dares enter. The trees still whisper in the wind. The cries of children still echo through the night. And if you listen closely, you might hear Evelyn's voice, soft and cruel, saying, "The curse will never end. The witch's end." For as long as the people of Black Hollow could remember, there had been rumors of a witch who lived in the valley. Her name was Sigrid, and she was a legend whispered from one generation to the next. Her story was one of tragedy, but also one of forbidden power. A woman who had once been loved, but was abandoned and betrayed. Her heart turned cold by the pain she had endured. Sigrid was said to have been a healer, a woman who could ease any suffering with the gentleness of her hands. The villagers would seek her out when their children fell ill or when crops withered. But Sigrid's gifts were not without cost. It was said that for every life she saved, She took a piece of her own soul, and as time passed, those pieces were replaced with darkness. When her magic became too powerful, too undeniable, the villagers grew frightened. They feared the witch and the shadow she cast over Black Hollow. Their fear turned to hatred when, one cold winter night, Sigrid's lover, Yerrick, was found dead at the edge of the forest, his body drained of life, his eyes wide open in terror. The villagers, driven by fear and grief, accused Sigrid of murder, but Sigrid knew the truth. Her love for Yerrick had been pure, yet it was tainted by the very powers that had corrupted her. She had not killed him. No, it was something darker, something beyond her control. Yet, in their rage, the villagers did not listen. They gathered in the dead of night and stormed her home. They came with torches and pitchforks, armed with their ignorance and superstition. Sigrid pleaded with them, but they would not listen. She had no choice but to flee, leaving behind the village she had once called home. Her heart broken and her soul fractured, she retreated into the darkest part of the valley, vowing that one day they would all come to know the true price of their betrayal. Years passed. Black Hollow grew silent, its once thriving village now just a memory of what it had been. The valley was abandoned. The forest that surrounded it became overgrown, hiding the remnants of a place lost to time. But the witch had not forgotten. It was on the night of the autumn equinox, when the moon was full and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful cry, that the first signs of Sigrid's return began. It started with the animals, foxes, wolves, and birds, that had once filled the valley, now wandering the village square, their eyes wild and glassy, their fur matted and tangled. They would sit in the center of the town, silent and unmoving, staring with unblinking eyes at the old, empty homes. Then the nightmares came. The villagers, now few in number, began to dream of the witch, dreams so vivid and real they could not distinguish them from waking life. In these dreams, Sigrid would appear in the dark corners of their minds, her voice like the rustling of leaves in the wind, whispering their sins back to them. She would call their names, one by one, until they woke in terror, sweat beading on their foreheads. But it was not just the dreams that haunted them. At night, when the villagers lay in their beds, they would hear her, the faint, distant sound of footsteps, echoing through the empty streets. And though they never saw her, they knew she was there, watching them from the shadows. Waiting. The fear was palpable, suffocating the town in a fog of dread. People began to disappear. First, it was the children, the innocent ones who had never known the pain of betrayal. Then, it was the old, the sick, the forgotten. Each night, someone else would vanish without a trace, their homes left untouched, their lives erased. Those who remained lived in constant terror. They locked their doors and windows, but they knew it was only a matter of time before Sigrid came for them. And so, they waited, trapped in their own nightmares, knowing that the witch's curse could not be undone. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned crimson, a single figure appeared at the edge of Black Hollow. It was a woman, cloaked in a tattered black robe, her face obscured by a hood. Her presence seemed to draw the very life from the land, the trees shivering, the wind dying down in fear. The villagers, seeing her approach, recoiled in terror. But it was too late. The woman stepped into the heart of the village and threw back her hood, revealing a face both familiar and haunting. It was Sigrid, her skin pale as bone, her eyes hollow voids of emptiness. Her once beautiful features were now twisted, her face drawn with centuries of pain and sorrow. The magic that had once been a gift was now her curse, consuming her with every breath. "You betrayed me," Sigrid whispered, her voice carrying through the empty streets like a cold wind. "Now, you will pay the price." With a wave of her hand, the ground beneath the villagers' feet began to crack. From the earth rose tendrils of dark, twisted vines, their thorns sharp as daggers. The villagers tried to run, but the vines lashed out, wrapping around them like snakes, pulling them into the dirt. Their screams filled the air, but Sigrid remained silent, watching, as though savoring each cry. One by one, they were pulled into the ground, their bodies consumed by the earth, their souls trapped forever in the witch's curse. When the last of the villagers had disappeared, Sigrid stood alone in the center of the town. The once thriving village was now nothing more than an empty shell, its streets littered with broken dreams and forgotten lives. The witch's revenge had been fulfilled. The town was hers once again. The witch turned away from the ruins, her dark eyes reflecting the pale light of the full moon. The valley, once silent, was now alive with her power, the wind carrying her laughter across the land. And so, Sigrid's curse lived on, forever. The Valley of Black Hollow would remain a place of death, its spirits trapped in the eternal grip of the witch's wrath.